Hello, Cloud Native Data Management Day, co-located here at KubeCon EU. And welcome everybody to the highlight of the day, I hope. Now, it's going to be an exciting panel, so welcome everybody. While you're just getting yourselves comfortable, let me run through just a really quick bit of kind of housekeeping. So we've got an absolutely epic panel, and I'm hoping there's going to be some properly lively discussion. I do want to point out, if you look at the platform up towards the top right is a chat session. Look, we'd all love to be there in person, and we'd love to catch up to you, bump into you in the corridors, have a drink at an after party event, something like that, but we can't do that. We do want it to be, though, as interactive as possible. So please use the chat window if you have any questions, even if you just want to say hi. I will say, though, that the panelists and myself, as we're talking, probably not going to have a lot of spare cycles to monitor the chat window. So what I would say is that if you see a question come in from anybody else and you think you know the answer, honestly, knock yourself out, get involved. We'd love to have your help with that. But also, when the session's finished, some of us may be able to stick around at the end when we're no longer live. I'll certainly do that. And if there's still questions going on, I'll do my best to answer those. Everybody that's joining, feel free to say who you are and where you're from. We'd love to know who's watching and in attendance. So, or I just want to say as well, when it comes to questions, like if you do put questions in the chat window, this is a properly safe place, right? So there are no silly questions or no embarrassing questions. And I'll hold my hand up and say, likewise, like if I'm sticking around at the end to answer questions, I'm not embarrassed if I'm not clever enough to answer them either. So please don't be embarrassed to answer questions. This is a safe place. We're all here for the fun and to learn at the end of the day, right? We're hanging out. And hopefully the conversation we're about to have with the panelists will give you that kind of a vibe. We're just a bunch of people that love this technology and are part of it and want to hang out and talk about it. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests. So I'll just ask them each to introduce themselves. So I'll go, Andy, if you go first, and then Cheryl, and then Chris, and then Michael.
Thanks, Nigel. So yeah, I'm Andy Jeffries. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Civo, which is a hosting company in the UK, and we're building a Kubernetes virtualized platform on top of Kubernetes. So it's Kubernetes-ception from us. So yeah, and today is actually our launch day. We're coming out of beta, so it's a crazy busy day, but I'm super happy to be here and chat with the people.
Nice one.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Cheryl Hung. I'm the VP of Ecosystem at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So I primarily look after the end user community, which is the group of 140 plus companies that use and run Kubernetes in production.
Very cool.
Great. My name is Chris Evans. I've been in the industry about more years than I'd care to mention, probably more than 30. Mostly storage related, I guess. Data storage pretty much in everything, although I've done 2 startups, one of which went public. And I have a big fascination for the mainframe, as Nigel will tell you at some point. I see lots of people joining, which is quite good to see. Lots of familiar faces and names. If you want to find me, I'm online at architecting.it.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. So I'm Michael Cade. I'm a technologist, whatever that means. I'm sure we'll probably get into a bit of that later. But I work for Veeam, or I work for Kasten by Veeam now. So I've focused my efforts around everything that I've done over the last 6 years, from a virtualization point, an industry around storage, all of that now leapfrogged into this Kubernetes and cloud native world, and trying to find my feet and help build technical community, technical content, and all of that good stuff around this new world.
Cool. Okay. I'm just typing in the chat window there, just telling people I am jealous of Chris's mainframe background. I'm not jealous of his age, though, so I can't have both, I don't think.
No, I'm afraid not.
Anyway, so let's crack on with the first question. I'll pitch the question out there. If we can take this one in the order that you introduced yourselves as well, though. So we'll let Andy go, and then Cheryl, then Chris, then Michael. I just want to get the panel's feel for whether or not they think that containers in general, right, are a good choice for stateful workloads. So what's your take on that, Andy?
I definitely think they are now. They didn't used to be with the storage options. It was all too easy to try and launch things that needed to save state. But now there's so many benefits to containers, isolation, consistency, low resource overhead, things like that, that definitely we run lots of different stateful workloads, and so do our customers. So I think it's a great choice at the moment.
Cool.
I'm actually slightly disappointed it hasn't moved faster. So I got into storage in 2017, and I thought that running stateful containers would be a solved problem within 18 months. I was a bit optimistic. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I do think it has improved, as Andy has said, a lot compared to where it was a few years ago.
Cool.
Yeah, I think technically you can, but whether you should or not is another question. And let me very briefly qualify this, and I'm sure we'll come back to discuss it in more detail in a second, but I'd like to see a little more around the operational side of things, some of the things that need to be in place in order to make sure that you're supporting data in an enterprise environment. So I think we're on the cusp of it, but we're not entirely there yet for full support.
Yeah, and even given where I work and who pay me, who it's obviously around protecting those stateful workloads, but I actually think containers alone with storage, that's a very different thing to where we're going to get to later on, like talking about container orchestration as well, right? So I think the whole resource isolation, the different solutions that you have, the storage specs and different storage types that you have available, it's not as easy as it's not as easy as it should be, like it is with a virtual machine or like a physical machine where we just plug into a fabric, we plug into something and consume that, especially given the nature of the containers, like that they spin up, they spin down. They're very dynamic in how long they live for and what their first purpose was around being stateless. But yeah, I know that we're going to get into a lot more of this, so I won't use it all at once.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So I really appreciate everybody's responses. I think Cheryl's really resonated with me. So I'm a former storage guy, even wrote a book on the subject. I know other people on the call have written books on storage as well. And when I moved over into containers, the day, and I feel like we are starting to get there. I said it in the keynote this morning that the fact that we've got a cloud native data management day, I think says a lot. There's obviously stuff is happening there. But I've looked forward to the day when the two worlds would kind of come together. And I've been looking forward and looking forward and looking forward like a kid on Christmas Eve. If you celebrate Christmas, it's like, the time seems to almost go backwards. And I'm like Cheryl a bit, that I'm super surprised that it hasn't progressed so far. Anyway, so that's everybody's take on like kind of containers in general. Let's switch focus now to Kubernetes as a container orchestrator, right? Is Kubernetes ready for stateful workloads now? Okay, and I'm happy for anybody to answer. Not everybody on the panel has to answer every question. So just go ahead. If you think you've got something to say on whether Kubernetes is ready for stateful workloads now, let's have your opinion.
So I'll go.
Go on, Michael. Go for it.
So I think this is where I start to think actually where containers on their own they have a use case, they have a play, but as soon as you start putting a container orchestration engine on top, Kubernetes, for example, I think that could potentially, again, we're not fully there, but everything that you spoke about and Jing Yang as well this morning around the CSI and the enhancements that have gone on there, I think we're definitely getting closer to that fully functional storage behavior that we want to see under the covers, like being able to leverage snapshots, being able to, from an operation point of view, and I'll try not to steal your thunder, Chris, as well, but that operation side, being able to understand and play with this storage, and being able to keep the lights on, be able to do all of the things that they've been able to do in different platforms. I think that's another big part that is ready for today, that is there, that we've got mega big customers running like stateful database servers and databases across their across their Kubernetes clusters, across different clouds, etc., all taking advantage of the statefulness of the data. So I think Kubernetes does bring that element of looking after that data a lot better than just containers on their own.
Okay.
Okay. I think I agree with mostly what you're saying. I think my challenge with a lot of the hands-on, at least from the Kubernetes side that I've seen, is that I'm not sure it's as resilient as I would want it to be. I'm not sure it's as resilient as it would be if I was running something in a virtual environment where I'm sort of used to seeing something that doesn't really break on me very often. And from that perspective, I think there's just a little bit more to go to get that last little piece of consistency and resiliency. And I would ask the question as well, what do we think we really want to do with these environments? Are we going to run them permanently, long term, for weeks and months and years, like we do with other platforms? And if so, how are we going to manage that stateful workload if we want to do upgrades, rebuilds? There's a lot of operational challenges around that, I think.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll comment. Go on, Andy.
Go on, Cheryl. Go on.
So CNCF publishes a technology radar once a quarter where we look at different topics from the end user community. We ask the end users, what are you using? And the topic at the end of last year, end of 2020, was database storage. And what we saw in that survey was that there's two quite different styles. So for companies that are fully on a public cloud, they're actually pretty likely to just use a managed database service. Whereas companies that are either on-prem or maybe they're doing a mixture like hybrid on-prem and public cloud probably are not using managed any kind of stateful workloads within Kubernetes at all. Obviously, there's quite a bit of variation there, but it seems like the new tools that are coming out to help manage stateful workloads are not quite mature enough yet for most companies to move their stateful workloads. So they either go for a managed database or they're just still waiting.
Cool. Andy?
Yeah, so we're actually implementing managed databases on top of Kubernetes. So kind of we're expecting long-running stateful workloads to remain in place, replicated across the cluster and resilient to sort of hardware failures that way. So we definitely think Kubernetes is ready. We've kind of built, as Kelsey Hightower always says, it's a platform for building platforms. So our new Civo platform is built on top of Kubernetes for that reason. So
Nigel, can I just come back in and ask just ask Andy something related to that? So imagine, your environment, Andy, when you're looking at how you're setting things up, imagine you're in a position where something breaks. So how many levels of skill do the people who look after your infrastructure need to have to understand, for instance, when something crashes, how to recover a database that's now not running, for example, to forward recover that if it's been corrupted or other things like that? Do you have to have multiple people with multiple skills? And is that why, for example, as Cheryl's mentioned, people have decided to take the managed database option rather than necessarily running it themselves, because there's a skill challenge here that you're having to look at potential issues on multiple different levels?
100% agree. So yeah, so within our team, we've got people who are experienced at running MySQL on large clusters. We've got Kubernetes administrators. We've got old school sysadmins, and they kind of all come together and sort of overlap in what they know skill wise, which is, I guess, what gives you the advantage of someone providing a managed database, which is what we're doing, versus running it yourself, that someone out there hopefully has seen the same sort of problems that you're seeing right at this moment and can fix them. So it's definitely a challenge to try and make sure everyone or the team maintains the skill set we need. But yeah, no, I definitely agree. There's a lot of different layers of skills needed.
Okay, so let me just pitch in real quick, and I hope I'm all right because I did just drop off for a second there. Before moving us on to the next question, I'm just looking at the time, but I also want to, I can't resist saying just something real quick here, is that the experience that I have is, I think, along the lines of what's been talked about there, but traditional enterprises don't feel that these platforms are ready because they've got so much heritage and experience in doing things, not in complex ways, but really advanced data management features on some of the platforms that they run on premises and things with their business critical apps. Whereas companies that are born in the cloud, I think, like Cheryl mentioned, they've got much more of an appetite to just run with something like this, and they may not have data on their back ends that is quite as rich and needs quite as much care taking of. Anyway, look, I want us to park that one for now. Does anybody have any thoughts on like what are some key data management features that are missing in Kubernetes that if they were there would make it a better place for stateful workloads? And I'm going to throw this at particular people so we don't just talk over each other. No sweat if you don't want to say something on this. I'll go around the screen. Cheryl, do you have any particular feature that you think's missing that would be like a killer feature?
That is a really interesting question. I think one of the CNCF projects actually that I've really always liked the look of and I think is underrated is VTES, because VTES is the ability to take a normal MySQL database and scale it horizontally. I think it came out of YouTube originally, and this is something I feel like a lot of companies could benefit from, but haven't taken advantage of so much yet. So it's not really a feature that's missing from Kubernetes necessarily, but it's a capacity or capability that I think is I think it's underrated.
Cool. Okay. Michael, you got any thoughts on missing features or killer features?
It's interesting from a data management when you start looking at like the CSI and how that's evolving over time, like all the different volume snapshot classes, the snapshot capability in there, especially from a backup, we leverage that and then offload that out into a different storage tier. But probably to go to Cheryl's point is that whole operator model of how you allow you to transport or make it portable from a traditional database, virtual machine, cloud, IaaS, PaaS, or whatever into getting the same functionality that you get within Kubernetes with those workloads. That would be very interesting to say the least, and may help that the adoption rate go up even more.
Sure. Yeah. Chris, any thoughts?
Well, I have an entire book that I can refer to here, Nigel, which has got everything there you'd ever want to know on storage, as well as many others. But so I've got to try and narrow that down into something that's just one thing we can pick on. And I'm going to go really generic and say metadata. And you might think, well, what do you mean by metadata? Well, what I mean by that is that when we create data and store data, whether we're moving it between applications or we're backing it up or whatever we're doing with it, we need to be able to attribute it if we're keeping it long term. And with Kubernetes environments, and especially with containers, that data is going to be the application around it is going to be more short-lived than the data. So we need ways of actually tagging and attributing our data with enough metadata so we know what it belongs to in the future. And that sort of goes to some of the things we've already discussed. So I'd like to see more metadata connected to my objects that I use for storing my data in the platform.
Cool. Okay. On that topic of the applications that sit around the data being less long-lived than they might be in like a physical or a virtual machine environment, I kind of wonder whether that's changing a little bit and whether we're starting to see containers and Kubernetes as more of a viable choice for those more long-lived applications as well, and not just something that's more ephemeral, here today, gone tomorrow, throw it away type thing. Anyway, Andy, any key missing features in your opinion?
Yeah, the biggest one for me is a sort of standardized, maybe at the CSI level, of quality of service. Obviously, as a hosting provider, we've got a bunch of different customers sharing hardware, and it doesn't take much for one customer to suddenly slam all of the disks and everyone else's reads and writes go down. So we're obviously putting things in place at various levels to do that, and I just think having that at the CSI level would be, well, maybe challenging, super useful. But I have to say, having just spent the past couple of months writing my first CSI driver, I'm really impressed with the CSI specification.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Do you know what, though? I'm not even convinced that I could be wrong, right? And somebody shoot me down here. I'm not even convinced that kind of a problem is already solved outside of containers and Kubernetes anyway. I still get the feeling that storage platforms and things, even in the enterprise, wrapped with virtual machines and stuff, still struggle with that a bit. I mean, feel free to tell me if you think I'm wrong, anybody.
It's true. No, Nigel, you're not wrong. It's absolutely true that almost every vendor really doesn't implement quality of service the way they should do. There's a massive focus on IOPS and bandwidth. There's zero focus on latency, which obviously can directly affect an application that's a database. So, you know, if you want something that you can guarantee the latency to, you just don't get that in quality of service. And I think as a result, we've seen some features around that going into some of the container native solutions, but there's a lot more work, and there's going to be a huge amount of work needed to tie up the physical platforms that you're putting your solution onto and how those integrate into either a container attached storage and or the Kubernetes network. You know, there's still an awful lot of work to go there.
I'll add something into that as well. Like, so you're not wrong, Nigel. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong there either. But but the thing around the metadata piece as well that just got me thinking, Chris, was quite interesting in that we've said it already as well about Kubernetes being a platform. And if we look at the virtualization platforms that we've all played with and managed, the metadata doesn't necessarily sit within the platform there either. The metadata is objective to something outside or potentially on the storage array, on the actual in the cloud, looking at like, but it's outside of the platform. But Chris, I think that's super interesting. That is that we're potentially in a position where we could start implementing things like operators that will allow you to capture that data that is being stored in XYZ database and start to understand more about what that is, how long it lives for, what do you need it for, and that's just the top of the iceberg, yeah. Right? Once you get that metadata management, like that will allow data management to be something that's just built in, and you won't have to have boring conversations about backup anymore because it will just happen. It will be based and nice and easy.
So, Nigel, sorry, I don't want to sort of divert too far, but just to give you one example, imagine a scenario where you're running a traditional database in a virtual machine. If you've got the system set up correctly, you could snap that data, take that somewhere else, and you could import that data potentially into a container running that same application code, database code, and maybe you could use that as your way of extracting new records instead of having to do a backup, you know, ETL type process. You could do that every 10 seconds, every 15 seconds, because spinning up that new container that maps to that image snapshot will be really easy and lightweight. So there's a real need to have cross-platform metadata as well as, you know, just in the Kubernetes environment. So this is a bigger picture than just Kubernetes.
Yeah. Do you know what, on this question, and I know I'm the host and like probably not supposed to be giving answers, but I want to pitch in on this one as well. Like, so for me, right, it's not a feature, so to speak, but I think it's just the conversation that we've had here that's made me really think about this in this context, is that I want something, and maybe it sits above Kubernetes, but something that understands an application as a whole. So like all of the objects that make up an application, that might be a bunch of pods and containers, right? And some secrets and some volumes and some networking stuff, be able to understand that so that we can say, migrate it or back it up or move it or whatever, right? Without us having to get into the detail and have a bunch of experts around, just to be able to say, oh yeah, that's such and such an application, shift it, migrate it. That sort of awareness of what makes up an application. And I feel like we're on a journey to that point, but still really, really, really far away from it. Right, so let me just bump on to the next question, right? And it's a little bit related to what we just talked about there. Still with that in your mind around features and things that we feel are missing. Whose responsibility is it to bring those features to the table? What I'm thinking is like, and you can think wider and broader than this, but just in my mind, it was like, is it the responsibility of the Kubernetes project to bring some of these features? And it might be for some and might not be for others. Or is it the project of, you know, at home open source developers that are just contributing on their own? Is it the responsibility of vendors? Whose responsibility is that? And I'll go to Michael first this time.
So
put it on the spot, mate.
Yeah, I think you hit it though. Is that, well, sometimes it is going to be the Kubernetes project because there's a wider requirement for those features, but then it's going to come down to the open source community about. That's how we've got so much happening so fast within this community, is because people are having these daily problems and they're going out and they're fixing it. It's not just a vendor scratched team that are making things happen anymore, which is where we've all come from, right? The vendor approach of, oh, we need a vendor to go and fix that problem for us, and then you buy it off the shelf. Actually, the more I dive into this whole world, it's actually a lot more open source, and you actually start looking at, well, how could I live my life a little bit more open source, and how, but without going down too much of a track. But I think it depends. I think it depends on who has the problem and where the problem is. So if we're looking at metadata management and storage, that's a wider, that crosses every vertical that you can think of. They might not think it, they might not know it, but that's going to benefit everyone. But for something else, it might just benefit the financial, the fintech. It might just benefit retail. And then that's going to come down to who is in that space, understands that space, and makes that an open source. Or this is how vendors are being born today, rather than a big backing and then a long lifespan. Vendors come out of the woodwork pretty much daily at the moment. So.
Yeah. Anybody else with any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I don't necessarily think it's a responsibility question. I think it's just who needs to start the process, because I think it's one of these things where someone has to kick this off with, here's an idea for how we could do this. Here's what the specification should look like for quality of service, as an example that I was saying about earlier. These are the sort of things we could control on our platform. What do we think about this as a standard? And then it's things like the storage special interest group for Kubernetes that would then take that and formulate into part of the spec. Customers using these would then comment and say, this doesn't work for our use case. So I think it's very much a collaborative thing, but maybe driven by, I'd say, storage providers rather than vendors, because I do agree with Michael, there's individual people springing up trying to build these things as well. It's not just massive companies. So, I think it's up to someone to suggest these are what we could implement, we think. Does this work for everyone else?
Anybody else?
Okay, go ahead, Cheryl.
No, you go, Chris. I'll go after you.
Okay. I think the depends answer is obviously the most easiest one to give, but I'll give an example of something I think which probably helps us understand why I think it's a depends type scenario. So think back to virtualization when we wanted to do things like backup out of a virtual environment like vSphere. We needed the infrastructure to have that API to allow us to take those backups and snapshots out of that infrastructure, because we didn't really have a direct connection to that data. So I think we have to look at this on a case-by-case basis and say, does it need to be part of the ecosystem? Because that by doing it as part of the ecosystem, it will give us a better implementation than we would do if we tried to do it as a side implementation. And in which case, we should do it as part of the infrastructure. But I don't think we should be trying to lever in every single possible thing into the platform.
Cool.
So I'm kind of split here, because I previously worked at a storage vendor. Now I'm more community focused, so I kind of bias in both ways. But actually, I had a question for everybody else, or a thought perhaps. I feel like compared to compute and networking and lots of other topics within cloud native, storage has stayed a bit closer to the vendor side compared to the other topics, which feel a little bit more community. I wonder if anyone has thoughts about why this would be the case.
I could give you an answer straight away.
Me too.
Go on, Chris.
Well, 2 points. Storage is hard. Storage is really hard to do and get right. And second of all, the data is the most valuable thing you've got. So if you look at something like networking is just passing things around. It's like a big game of pass the parcel. If it doesn't work, it's okay. You just drop it and start again. But if you lose your data's gone, and that's your business. So people are very cautious about making sure they're never going to lose their data. And doing storage right is hard.
Way to upset all the networking people that might be on the call.
I've done my very best, yeah.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. I think I really agree with that. And I think I touched on it in the keynote earlier this morning as well. I said that, if you're one of these application developers that's been developing your applications, generally stateless applications on containers and Kubernetes, your world is about to change. You're about to inherit and be given the keys to this super valuable data that if it's leaked or if it's lost, you could lose your job, your customers. In fact, in some cases, businesses could go bust as well if data is lost. So that's my opinion, that certainly enterprises, that they're really risk averse as well, aren't they? So I always find it a challenge for these storage startups that do amazing things. I used to work in a lot of banks in the UK, right? And I would love what storage startups were doing. But it was so hard for me to get them into the bank because the senior leadership were just like, it was the you won't get sacked if you buy IBM or EMC or NetApp or whoever, right? And so despite the innovation, there's just a hesitancy to risk the crown jewels. We're all Brits on here, right? So to speak. I say we're all Brits on the panel. Of course, we are truly international on the event. Does anybody else have anything else around that? It's a really good question, though, Cheryl. I like it.
So I do as well. Like in that. So everything that Chris said as well, agree with him on that, and that storage is difficult. We've all played around with storage. I shouldn't say played or messed around with storage. We've all been in a storage situation where we've looked after it. But if we think about like developers, DevOps, and that culture, their level of storage, and this isn't bad mouth or trying not to bad mouth DevOps or that culture, is that their storage is a database. They don't necessarily understand how everything gets to the storage layer, the LUNs, the volumes, the disks, how it's then cached, and all of the other words that we can put in under the database. And Kubernetes has been very much focused on, well, how do we deliver the application? How do we deliver the application that serves whatever that database is? And it's only when you start now with databases where we need to have performance, and I keep using that as an example, but there's message queues and other like batch processing, all required just different requirements when it comes to storage. And I think that opens up a huge point in that what Cheryl said is that, one, there is that requirement to have to put trust in it, which generally means that you're probably not going to go with an open source storage approach. You're going to have to go with some enterprise storage because you need the 24/7 support, but also you need someone that's tried and tested this, that is going to have your back and help you from a design and architecture point of view.
Very cool. I'm going to bring this question to an end. I don't want us to address this, but I have seen Chinfar's point about the opportunity for vendors to exercise lock-in as well. Touchy subject, we won't go there. We do have one more question that I would like us to try and wrap the panel with. I'm curious what people's take is on whether or not Kubernetes and containers in general will ever be a platform or a destination where we can do everything. And I think, like Chris Evans has mentioned a couple of times, that there's certainly a reputation that containers and Kubernetes is for more ephemeral workloads and things. Do we think we can get to a point where maybe the mainframe to one side, okay, everything else could be accomplished on containers orchestrated by Kubernetes? And because Andy didn't answer in the last question, or I don't know, maybe he answered first. I'll go to Andy first, and I would like to go around everybody. We've got about maybe 5 minutes.
Okay. So I think everyone's sort of experiences are shaped by what they've seen, what they've worked with, etc. So our platform's aimed at more sort of small development companies. Obviously now we're growing more into enterprise customers as well, but it's been shaped by that smaller use cases. So I think traditionally one of the most non-cloud native thing is people want to launch an instance and run whatever junk they want on there and keep it running long term. And we've got customers doing that as much as sort of it pains us from a cloud native point of view. From a customer point of view, is what they want to do. So I think if we can run long-term pets, virtual machines running their website that they run their blog on or whatever they're doing, and they don't want to lose it, then I think it pretty much fits most things. The only other challenge I think we've had, particularly around storage, was before read-write many became popular. So being able to fire up multiple pods, running, let's say, a WordPress blog and uploading files into a shared storage area wasn't feasible before read-write many became popular. So while I'm sure there's things that don't fit, I think that gap is becoming much smaller, and for all the use cases we're seeing, it's certainly feasible now. So
cool, thanks Andy. Cheryl, any thoughts?
Andy saying that we will biased by our experience reminded me that I started off my career as a software engineer at Google, and Google uses Borg, which was the predecessor to Kubernetes. It is a solved problem at Google. It is very possible to run state, to have stateful applications running on Borg. So I'm fundamentally optimistic. I think this is a solvable problem, and I think we will get there.
Love it. Michael?
Yeah, I think it's important to look back at over any platform that we've ever had access to, and none of it's anything that's gone through the roof. Physical servers, physical machines, virtual machines, more recently cloud IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, and Kubernetes, or any container orchestration, containers in there as well. They're not. There's a time and a place. There's a choice. There's a flexibility. People will make the wrong decision because that's what we do as people. We make bad decisions and then we evolve from that. None of them are going away. Will everything run in containers or Kubernetes? No, it won't. I think there'll be something else as well, right?
Yeah.
I think you choose the right platform. I use a car. I've been talking this analogy for a while, is that use cars or motor vehicles as an analogy. Is that, well, you wouldn't move your house with just a motorbike or a bicycle. You're going to go and get the right tool for the job. And I think that's how you look at your platforms, as to where you need to run your applications, run your data and stuff like that.
Cool. Chris, any final parting thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, you know that the mainframe was the original container environment, don't you?
Of course, it was the original for everything, apparently.
Seriously, I mean, so you could run very short-lived tasks, which were jobs, or you could run things more long-term. But at the end of the day, the key thing was that the platform itself was reliable, so that you didn't reboot the mainframe for months, years. You just didn't need to. So I guess if we can get to a situation where we're 100% convinced that our infrastructure is that level of reliable, then I think Kubernetes will be, like Michael said, one of the major pieces in which we'll deploy our applications. But if you look at the history of the last 20 or 30 years, we've moved further and further away from large-scale packaging of applications, more towards wanting to run individual pieces of code against data. And as a result, the data that we have, we need to protect better and look after better, because ultimately the application is becoming the ephemeral piece, whereas the data is the long-lived piece. So we should be focusing on making sure we can keep our data safe long-term, and we can track it and use it and monitor it. And then we can run any application on it we want.
Cool, I like it.
Just quickly before you wrap up, Nigel, I know we're almost out of time. I just wanted to quickly add to Cheryl's point. If anyone hasn't read it, Google's Site Reliability Engineering book describes how they moved MySQL onto Borg in 2008. And it's got some great nuggets there on how they moved their stateful workloads.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Andy. That's a great shout out. Good value. To Cheryl's point, well, not a point, to a mention of Borg. My opinion on this is so cheesy, I'm sorry, is resistance is futile. I had to say it. Look, I really appreciate everybody's opinions and contributing your expertise there. I think it's been a really good panel. To everybody that's been joining in on the chat as well, really appreciate that. Posing your questions, answering questions. I know some of the panelists have got involved as well. I do need to wrap this because I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to be finished for 5 to the hour. So look, there's still loads of other great things going on. We've got another panel later on this afternoon with some great people on it. There's more events on the main stage. There's breakout sessions. Hashtag CNDM days on the socials. If you mention me, I'll do my best to try and respond to anything. I'm going to kill the broadcast now, but anybody that wants to stick around and answer any more of the questions on the chat, feel free to. I include the panelists on that and anybody that's joined the call, but no pressure if you can't. So thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of the event, and also KubeCon. Have a great time.
Cheers, Nigel.
Thanks so much.
Everyone.